Hello, my name is Sarah and I'm from CatchPTSD.com, making PTSD understandable. Sometimes we try to find visual images to explain to our clients what's happening to them when they have PTSD. And one of the best visual ways to show someone how PTSD works is to use Russian dolls. And you might remember these from your childhood, but these dolls are dolls that have multiple dolls inside of them. And this is Frank. He's going to be my assistant today in explaining how PTSD works inside of somebody. So if you can imagine that Frank is a 25-year-old guy. Frank is obviously a soldier here, but he doesn't have to be. He can be a civilian, he can be a first responder, he can be a policeman, he can be in any walk of life. And just imagine that Frank is living life with a real chronic insecurity, a lack of self-esteem, real worry about that he won't succeed in life, a bit too worried to go out and try and get himself a girlfriend. And he turns up at a hypnotherapy clinic and he says, I just want to be different. I just want someone to take away all this worry, all this upset, all this nervousness that I feel inside of me for no reason, it seems. And I want to put my life back on track. I want to go for jobs and get the jobs I want. And maybe he's been offered a job that he has to turn up for an interview for, or a board that he has to attend. And he's really absolutely terrified that his lack of self-esteem, his insecurity is going to be a problem. So he comes to a hypnotherapist and says, help me. Well, we could look at Frank and think, well, obviously he's got clear problems on the outside. We'll just do a little bit of hypnotherapy with him. We'll tell him while he's in deep relaxation that you're fine, you feel great, everything's perfect, and then he'll get better. But what we have to be aware of as hypnotherapists is that Frank that turns up in your office at the age of 25 has not just been like delivered to earth on that day. Things have happened to him. People have said things to him. He's experienced things which are quite complicated, quite difficult. All of us have got some level of emotional difficulty in our past. And all of that plays a part in how we react, in how our bodies react. So if we put aside 25-year-old Frank for now, and then just be aware that when Frank was small, little Frank, when he was, say, only about 3 years old, there were impacts on his life that formed his personality. So let's imagine that 3-year-old Frank was a very nervous little boy. Maybe he was living in an abusive household. Maybe his father drank a lot and used to come home from the pub very, very angry sometimes. Maybe his mother was very nervous, very anxious because she was never sure how his father would react. Maybe he was often dragged into the middle of it. Maybe he used to sleep in his parents' bed and his mother did that so that the father couldn't attack her. All these things would have been swirling around Frank when he was just a tiny little dot. And even though we think that babies don't take in much of what's going around them, I think as hypnotherapists, we've pretty much understood that babies have adult emotions. They don't show it, they can't explain it, they can't tell you how they're feeling, but they do absorb emotion just like an adult. And so little Frank became quite a nervous child, an upset child, a worried child. He craved the love of his mother and father, but the two of them were pretty much living in a war zone and were really, really not seeing to his needs and what he needed to know. So then Frank grew up. So we can then move on to 6-year-old Frank. But as Frank grew up, these two are not two separate entities. The little one is inside the big one. Everything that that tiny boy experienced was still inside that 6-year-old boy as he grew up and went through life. And now 6-year-old Frank has started school. He doesn't really seek out the company of other people because he doesn't trust a lot of people because he's been treated so badly. He's a very nervous little boy. And because he's nervous, maybe he's being bullied by the other children. So now he gets bullied at school. And then he goes home to a very, very unstable situation, very difficult environment. And so really, all he's trying to do in life is keep his head down, try and deflect people, try not to get into trouble at any point. and just hoping that no one really notices him, and believing that a lot of the treatment that he's endured up to this little age of 6 is his fault, that he wasn't good enough, that somewhere along the line he was unlovable, that he isn't able to play with all the other kids in the playground. And he's internalized as well a certain level of anger, and anger that he's been put in this situation all the way through his life. So we have a little 6-year-old boy now who's developed a personality that maybe teachers see as antisocial. He doesn't want to be involved. He doesn't want to join in. He doesn't seem to be very smart because he hardly speaks, keeps his head down, and little is expected of him. So then he grows up again. And then we have 10-year-old Frank. And once again, 10-year-old Frank didn't get dropped out of a spaceship. 10-year-old Frank has got everything that happened to 3-year-old and 6-year-old Frank inside of him, just like those Russian dolls that we played with as kids. And you can hear all that trouble inside of him, all the upset of 3-year-old Frank, all the upset and scaredness of 6-year-old Frank is now in 10-year-old Frank. And now things have changed in Frank's life. Now his father's left home, which might be a good thing because things are less violent at home. But his mother's got a new husband. Now he's got a stepfather. And the stepfather thinks that Frank is a bit weak, a little bit pathetic, doesn't get involved, doesn't give any real emotion, doesn't give any real interest. So the stepfather doesn't pay him very much attention. And the mother obviously has got a new partner and therefore is a bit more enamored of a new partner and doesn't have a lot of time for Frank. So Frank now, again, carries on through life, just keeping his head down, believing that no one really thinks that he's worth very much, believing that he's not going to really make much of a success in his life, but what he can do is make sure that no one hits him, no one attacks him. And maybe the bullying has calmed down a little bit, maybe that's been taken in hand by the school, but now he's about to go to big school. He's going to go up to high school, and who knows what's going to happen there? Who knows who's going to protect him there? And so all that worry, all that fear that little Frank has carried for so long is now inside 10-year-old Frank. And it's going to go forward, and we're going to see what happens. And so then we move on to 15-year-old Frank. Now, 15-year-old Frank, he went to high school, didn't have a choice. He's continued to live at home with his mother and his stepfather, doesn't see his father. Father gave up really seeing him, wasn't interested in the first place. So, and his mother is completely involved in a new life. Maybe she's got a couple of new children as well. So now he's not the center of her life, and very little support is being given to him. He's 15. He's still being bullied. He's trying to evade the most of the bullies by just keeping a low profile, but not always. Sometimes he gets aggressed at home, at school, and then cycles home, manages to get home, and then just sits in his room and doesn't really interact with the new family or the new stepfather. He doesn't really truly know what to do with his life. No one's really shown much interest to tell him what he could do, what he's capable of, what his biggest interests are. He hasn't really got many interests because he's really just tried to stay in his room, keep out of everybody's way. Now everyone around him's getting girlfriends. He doesn't believe that anyone would want him as a boyfriend. So he's not really tried. And there are some things that he's interested in life, quite interested in cars, quite interested in sport, but has absolutely no way how to make that as a career. And therefore, he's pretty much on his own, pretty isolated, not expecting anyone to think much of him. And then, of course, inside him is all the upset, all the trouble that's gone on through his life, all the ways that he's tried to cope through his life, which is pretty much head down, don't do anything, don't say anything, fear, upset, worry, lack of self-esteem. So, as a hypnotherapist, when 25-year-old Frank walks in to our sessions, we know that there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old Frank inside there. We know that what we're dealing with is probably not what 25-year-old Frank thinks is the problem. We know that all the way back down to 3 years old, there are unresolved issues. We know that everything that 25-year-old Frank feels actually relates to what 3-year-old Frank experienced. And that's why Catch Hypnotherapy uses such deep hypnotherapy. That's why we go back as far as we possibly can in our hypnotherapy sessions to find 3-year-old Frank, to find what he experienced, because everything he experienced is fueling the emotions that went up through Frank's life. The first time he ever met any worry, any upset, any violence, any hurt, he developed a reaction to it. And then that reaction was still inside the 6-year-old and the 10-year-old and the 15-year-old, and it's still inside 25-year-old Frank. So when he's told that he needs to go to a board and put himself forward and talk about his best bits and what he can do, he doesn't think he has any best bits. He doesn't have any self-esteem, because at 3 years old, he wasn't shown that he was worthy. He wasn't shown that he had something to bring to the world. And we could just put 25-year-old Frank into a hypnotic trance and tell him, you are wonderful, you feel great, you feel perfect. But it's not going to penetrate through the different Russian doll layers. It might work for a little while on 25-year-old Frank, but eventually 3-year-old Frank's going to push his way up from inside and say, actually, I don't feel that way. I am worried. I am scared of everything. And no, I don't have any self-esteem. So we have to go back to the first time that Frank ever met adversity and solve that. And that is what CatchPTSD hypnotherapy does. It takes you back, the body takes you back to that very first time. And when you understand the root and where it's all coming from, you'll find that all the symptoms in the present day just melt away. So if you believe that you have a little one inside of you that may have experienced things that's affecting how you react now, have a look at CatchPTSD.com. Pick one of the therapists there that appeals to you, and then come and help us explore your past to free you now in your present.